In a rapidly changing global landscape, Africa is redefining its place in the world. From economic transformation to energy security, to youth innovation and financial independence, the continent is increasingly shaping conversations once dominated elsewhere. In Nairobi, Kenya, leaders from across Africa and Europe gathered for a landmark moment, the inaugural Africa Forward Summit. Co-hosted by William Ruto and Emmanuel Macron, the summit brought together more than 30 heads of state and government under the theme Africa-France Partnerships for Innovation and Growth. Among the leaders participating was President Hakainde Hichilema, carrying Zambia's vision for investment, regional integration and sustainable development. On Tuesday, 12th May 2026, President Hakainde Hichilema arrived in Nairobi for the two-day summit. His aircraft touched down at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport at exactly 15:30 hours local time. The Zambian head of state was received by Kenya's Minister of Public Service, Human Capital Development and Special Programs, Geoffrey Ruku. Shortly after arrival, President Hichilema signed the visitor's book before proceeding to the Radisson Blu Hotel, where African leaders and global partners prepared for high-level engagements aimed at redefining Africa's future. As evening fell over Nairobi, President Hichilema joined fellow heads of state and government at the gala dinner hosted by Kenyan President William Ruto. The gathering offered leaders an opportunity to strengthen diplomatic ties ahead of the main summit. The following day, the Africa Forward Summit officially commenced at Kenyatta International Convention Center. Discussions centered on 7 strategic thematic areas, namely green industrialization, energy transition, economic partnerships and investment, global finance reform, youth entrepreneurship, climate sustainability, and peace and security. At the heart of these discussions was one critical question: how can Africa finance and drive its own development? More than 30 African leaders, business executives, policymakers and development partners had assembled in Nairobi, united by a shared vision to build a stronger, more self-reliant Africa. During a side meeting at the summit, President Hakainde Hichilema called on global investors to seize the opportunities emerging from Zambia's ongoing policy and legal reforms. The president highlighted reforms in the energy sector as a gateway for increased investment and regional growth. The Zambian leader emphasized the urgent need for investment in continental infrastructure, particularly power generation and transmission systems, capable of linking Southern Africa to North Africa. He stressed that Africa's development must ultimately be driven by Africans themselves. President Hichilema further underscored the importance of leveraging Africa's own resources to finance roads, energy projects, and logistical corridors capable of unlocking regional trade and economic transformation. And speaking during the opening ceremony, host President William Ruto delivered a strong message on African self-determination and economic sovereignty. The Kenyan leader observed that Africa possesses both the human and natural resources needed to finance its own future.
Shifting centers of influence, changing trade alignments, and the reconfiguration of global supply chains are redefining the architecture of the world economy itself. Yet, In moments such as this, fragmentation cannot be the answer, nor isolation the strategy. The times before us demand stronger cooperation, renewed multilateralism, and partnerships grounded not on hierarchy, but in sovereign equality, mutual respect, and shared responsibility. It is not how we do it. It is in that spirit that we convene this summit, grounded in our shared conviction that enduring partnerships must not be built on dependency, but on sovereign equality, not on aid or charity, but on mutually beneficial investments, and not on extraction or exploitation, but on win-win engagements.
President Ruto warned against outdated models based on aid dependence and called for mutual beneficial investments grounded in respect and shared prosperity. He also pointed to Africa's youthful population as the continent's greatest strategic asset.
The Africa we envision is an Africa of confidence, an Africa of ideas, an Africa of innovation, an Africa of enterprise, an Africa that believes in itself, invests in its people, mobilizes its own resources, and engages the world as an equal partner in shaping balanced, prosperous, and peaceful global future. Africa is rising, determined to shape its own destiny, and increasingly prepared to shape the future of the world itself. That is the Africa Forward agenda.
Co-host President Emmanuel Macron emphasized France's commitment to building a renewed relationship with Africa, one based on mutual respect, sovereignty, and equity. Mr. Macron said France was committed to supporting Africa's aspirations in economic development, peace, and security.
And what I have been trying to do for 10 years now is to construct a relationship which looks backwards with lucidity, and we've been working with Cameroon, Rwanda, Algeria, and several other nations, and which looks with bravery at the present, looking at the necessity of investing in sport and culture and creativity, looking at co-development and co-investment, and which is built on respect for the fact that Africa has its own agenda. The relations between Africa and France, as we see it, as the way we want to implement, are built on courage, respect, and a will to have a shared agenda. That's what we've been working on for 10 years. We spoke about it yesterday, so I won't go into it now. Why am I so convinced that this is the right way 10 years down the track? Because the challenges of Africa and Europe are shared challenges. We all want peace, prosperity, sovereignty.
At the same event, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres echoed calls for Africa to mobilize its own resources and challenged structural inequalities within the global financial system. The UN chief highlighted the disproportionate borrowing costs faced by African nations, barriers, he said, continue to limit the continent's development potential.
But let us be honest about what stands in Africa's way. A global system designed without Africa and still largely operating without Africa, perpetuating century-old injustices. A continent of more than 1.5 billion people with no permanent seats on the UN Security Council, as was referred by President William Ruto. Without the voice, the representation, and decision-making power it deserves inside the international financial institutions that shape this economy, it's not Africa that loses, it's the world that loses the fact that the voice of Africa is not conveniently taken into account. And on average, the continent faces borrowing costs twice as high as OECD countries as an average, draining resources that should be building the future. That is not a market verdict on Africa. It is a verdict on the injustices of the system.
On the margins of the summit, President Hichilema held a bilateral meeting with President William Ruto of Kenya. The two leaders discussed matters of mutual interest between Zambia and Kenya, reaffirming the long-standing friendship shared by the two nations. President Hichilema expressed gratitude to President Ruto and Macron for convening the summit and strengthening Africa's collective voice on issues of global importance. The relationship between Zambia and Kenya remains deeply rooted in the legacy of Africa's founding generation, led by Zambia's Dr. Kenneth Kaunda and Mzee Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. As the Africa Forward Summit concluded in Nairobi, one message resonated across the continent: Africa's future will be shaped not by dependence, but by partnership, innovation, and self-determination. For President Hakainde Hichilema, the summit provided an opportunity to position Zambia at the center of Africa's economic transformation agenda, championing investment, energy integration, and sustainable growth.